Thanks for being here tonight. Um, we're going to continue part two of our learning about the ban, prohibition on going to Egypt in the context of war and even peace. Our subject is ethics and values of Jews in times of war. And it's turning out that there's a lot of halakha in this one subject that you could really make a year course, certainly half a year course in a serious college on Jewish ethics and values in times of war. Uh, People really underestimate how much halakha there is, how much law there is. When I was practicing law, uh, to refresh your memory briefly, I was a Rav for 10 years, and then I went to law school and changed careers, and I was an attorney for 10 years, and then went back to being a Rav for the last 20 years, past 20 years. When I became an attorney like a Jones Day, people often would come to me and say, "You were a rabbi and now you're a lawyer?" Like, I don't get it. How does that connect? And while it is true that rabbis are driven by one set of values most of the time, and lawyers, attorneys are driven by a set of values another time, depending on where you're at, there's a lot of overlap, or there's not, depending on who you are and where you're at. And I would explain to people, I'm not a reform rabbi. A reform rabbi is there for social justice, whatever that means. An Orthodox rabbi, part of what attracted me is that I love learning law. An Orthodox rabbi, Judaism is a religion that is substantially law, as you see from the books behind me, which are my library downstairs. I've got 4,000 books, and about 2,000 of them are Jewish law. Not only the Torah, but Shulchan Aruch, the Code of Jewish Law, Rambam, everything we've been learning. Even on Tuesdays in the Bible, as we study about David and Bathsheba, we're learning law. And people underestimate the degree to which Judaism is a different religion. It's a different concept. Christianity is primarily one of faith and dogma. And I'm not saying good or bad. I'm just saying that's what it is. It's faith and dogma. And Judaism is a lot of faith and dogma too. So not saying anything bad about it. But Judaism has a lot of laws. You start with 613 laws. Every person who learns about Judaism from the very beginning learns about the term Taryag Mitzvot, 613. And it's just like a number. Every knowledgeable Jew knows the number 613. And that's the number of laws there are in the Torah. And if you know a little bit more, you know that 248 of them are positive laws. Thou shalt do this and that. And 365 are negative laws, prohibitions, you shall not do this or that. So when you study to be a rabbi, I don't know what they study in Reform. I do know from some Reform rabbis I know, it ain't Gemara, or it ain't, I'll leave it at, it ain't Gemara. So I don't know what they study. They study about social justice and I don't know. Orthodox, you'd be fascinated if you've never studied for rabbinate. You basically study Talmud, everything we've been doing on Thursday nights. You just study the Talmud dry, and what makes it rich is you go into all the commentaries. That's what gives it flavor. And that's what you do. 4 years of yeshiva high school, Gemara, 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 Gemara. Then you go to college. If you go to yeshiva college or some other, Gemara, 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 Gemara. And then you go to Smicha program, Gemara, 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 and Shulchan Aruch, where you're not learning Gemara, which is legislative history, so you're studying halakha. You're not taking courses in climate change and illegal immigration, illegal aliens. You're studying Jewish law. So when people would say to me, I don't get it. If you're a rabbi, how could you become a lawyer? I love law. I love teaching law. I love studying law. So it's a perfect fit. And rabbis want to do good. You want to help people. And a lot of attorneys actually become attorneys because, at least in the beginning, they want to do pro bono and they want to help people. So what we're finding out is there's a lot of halacha. People don't realize how much law there is. And like I mentioned, the 613 laws, that's getting started. Hanukkah doesn't appear in the Torah or Tanakh. So there's all the Hanukkah laws, that's separate. And then there's all the Purim laws. So the Bible has Megillah, but it doesn't talk about so many of the laws. And we go on and on and on, so many laws. And then as time goes on and new developments occur, there's more laws. It's intellectually stimulating and fascinating. And there's so much law. I'll give you one example, we'll get into this now. I would give this example like at Jones study. What kind of law? I'd say, the Bible says you're not allowed to make a fire on the Sabbath day. Yeah, I've heard of that or I didn't hear. Okay, not allowed to make a fire on the Sabbath day. Are you allowed to use electricity on the Sabbath day? Because the Bible predated electricity. They didn't say anything. Well, I guess so. It's not like you're making a fire. Oh, yeah? Electricity. California. Every few days there's another wildfire generated by telephone lines falling down and electricity. Electricity makes fire. Electricity creates light. Electricity creates heat. So it turns out maybe electricity is like fire. And then a person, the non-Jew, says, yeah, that's interesting. So what's the answer? Ah, now you're into it. Well, that's what we study. Well, what is the answer? Well, I'm not going to tell you. You go ahead and do what I did and study 20 years and you'll find out. And so it suddenly turns out there's a whole discussion about electricity. As we know, you're not allowed to use electricity on Shabbat. Okay, I give away no electricity on Shabbat. Well, are you allowed to set a timer before Shabbat that automatically turns electricity on and off? And then there's a fascination, the non-Jewish person. I'm fascinated by that. What's the answer? And then you get that discussion. So let's say we come to a conclusion that you're allowed to preset your electric lighting before Shabbat automatically to go on and off on Shabbat. End of story. Well, they created a thing called TV, and we want to know who killed JR, and it's going to be on Friday night on Shabbat. Are you allowed to preset your television on a timer? Nowadays, the TVs have built-in timers so that you can watch the TV on Shabbat without turning it on or off. Well, that's an interesting question. What's the answer? Well, let's get into the legal analysis. And by the time we're done, well, you're not allowed to have a TV running on your house on Shabbat. It destroys the environment of Shabbat. So now there are overlays of all these different laws. And so you're not supposed to have it. Well, what about if we're at war, God forbid, in Israel? Now can you put your TV on Shabbat on a pre? Well, yeah. And so it goes. And that's just TV on Shabbat and electricity. So when we announced a year ago that we're going to be learning ethics and values of Jewish law in terms of wartime, there was Deuteronomy chapter 20, and it kept us busy for a while. But there's a lot. Final word on this. There's a not such a funny joke. The world's shortest books, the world's smallest books, there'll be an anti-Italian joke that the world's shortest book is this, and an anti-Polish joke that the world's smallest book is that. And then another joke of that category, what's the smallest book in the world? Jewish business ethics. Oh boy, that's so funny. Actually, it's one of the biggest books in the world. Jewish business ethics is Choshen Mishpat. That's one of the 4 sections of the Shulchan Aruch. And you should see a volume. A volume of Choshen Mishpat is big and thick. And there are 3 volumes. And then from that, you get into the thing that we were just talking about, electricity, where one thing leads to another, and all the books that have been written commenting on Choshen Mishpat. So there's a lot of laws. Jewish business ethics, no small thing. And there's a lot of laws. I remember a man in my shul who came to me, and he had a very complicated question. And I said to him after we worked it out and we came up with our answer, and it cost him a lot of money, cost him several $100,000 to follow the Jewish law. And he did what I told him he had to do. And it hurt me more than it hurt him to have to say that to him. But it was a very complicated question. And I told him about, there was a famous rabbi of a famous shtetl in the old world 100, 200 years ago. And the rabbi was there for about a year, and then he resigned. And everybody loved him, and he loved everybody. And they said, why are you quitting? And he said, I'll tell you why. I've been a rabbi in this community for a year, and people come to me every day with questions about kashrut. Actually put some milk in a chicken soup. They come to me with questions of Shabbat. Am I allowed to do this? They come to me with questions of every kind. In a year, no one has ever come to me with a question about business ethics. So this community is not for me. That's how important business ethics are. There's a lot. So I don't know that we expected that this would run a year. Now we're going into some very interesting variations. And based on what goes on in the world, well, we're probably within 3 months of concluding this course, at which point I'm going to present to you my new idea. I'd like to continue Thursday night learning timely halachic questions that are intellectually fascinating and very pertinent. Thank you for listening to the intro. Thank you for being here. This is Rabbi Dov Fisher, Young Israel of Orange County. If you are watching on YouTube, we hope you'll subscribe. We're up to 660 subscribers. We need 340 subscribers more to put us at 1,000, which will allow us to do certain things that YouTube requires. So please subscribe and pass along the word. Okay. You're not allowed to, a Jew is not allowed to reside in Egypt. Through the centuries, there have been Jewish communities, nevertheless, that established themselves in Egypt. One of the biggest Jewish communities in all history was in Alexandria, where they had 600,000 or 1,200,000 attending Shabbat services. So many people that they could not hear the Chazan, so he would have to wave a kerchief from way down at the center of the stadium for people to know when it was time to say Amen. And they were destroyed by Alexander the Great. And when the rabbis of the Talmud asked, why did God destroy such an extraordinary, nobody says Alexander the Great did it. It's understood it was by God's will. And why did God allow Alexander the Great to destroy such a remarkable Torah community? Because God had said, Jews may not live in Egypt. God had said this even to the degree, again, let's remind ourselves that here's Egypt, here's Israel, blue is Israel, so small in terms of square kilometers, so gigantic in terms of world history. And there's Egypt next door, southern border. And when we got out of Egypt, you'd see up Mitzrayim, we had to go around with the Red Sea. We couldn't go straight up, but we forget how close we were. When Moshe Rabbeinu sent out the Meraglim, the spies, it took them only 40 days, 40, to cross in, go to Hebron, look around, and come back. So Egypt was that close. It wasn't 40 years away. It was 40 days away, 20 days away. But the punishment of the Meraglim in the nation crying is that you'll be here for 40 years before. So I had to go all the way around with all kinds of stuff. I had to do a big circuitous following the clouds of glory, Ananei HaKavod, and at night following the Amudei Yesh, the pillars of fire. Over the course of time, Jews spread out. And what ended up happening, thanks to the Romans, is we went 2 directions. The Jews that went east towards France, England, and Germany are known as the Ashkenazim. We went that a ways, east. Germany was the main place we went. And in Talmudic times and in the Middle Ages, in Hebrew, it was known as the land of Ashkenaz. Now it's known as Germania. Interestingly, Germany seems, everybody's got another name for Germany. The French call it Allemagne, and America calls it Germany, and the Germans call it Deutschland. It's really interesting that how many different languages have a different name for Germany. So now we call it Germania, and in rabbinical literature, it was always called Ashkenaz. And that was the main landing point for Jews running east. We ended up in England, and we ended up in France. And am I even going the right direction, or is it that away? That's what I know. I'm a New Yorker. Basically, everything is First Avenue, Second Avenue in China. Actually, it was that way, Western Europe. And indeed, so we ended up mostly in Germany, Ashkenaz. So others of us ended up in England and France, and we became known as Ashkenazim. And the other main place the Jews ended up after being exiled by Rome. So Rome, that's like Italy, green. And obviously today's Italy is not that Rome, the Roman Empire, but it's the same place on the map. There's the famous boot. And Jews ended up in Spain. And the Hebrew word for Spain throughout all the centuries up to today is Sefard. Sfarad. And therefore the people who were based there were known as the Sefardim. Sefardim. And when things got really bad in Spain, they'd go to Morocco and Algeria. The majority of Sephardim, or certainly their largest community in Israel, are the Moroccans. They're also famously the Yemenites. They're down there, Teimanim. And Rambam was living in Spain. And when things got hairy, Jews were able to live under the Muslims, believe it or not. They were the good guys in those days. And when the Catholics came over and ruined everything, Rambam, as did so many others, had to flee. And they fled to Egypt. The Sephardim fled to Egypt. Spain was the golden land for the Jewish people. It was what today we think of in terms of exile. We think of Brooklyn and Flatbush and Williamsburg, Borough Park. In those days, it was Spain, the single biggest Torah center in the world. Rambam, Ibn Ezra, Rabbi Yehuda Levi. Well, many of them had to flee to Egypt. Some did not because they lived during the Arab period, the Muslim period, and others had to flee. So Rambam ended up in Egypt. And we were learning last week that itself is a halachic problem. Rambam, of all people, now he knows the stuff. How did he end up in a place that you're not allowed to live? And so that's kind of what we were learning last week. And we go from there. And we refresh our memories that this is Torah stuff. Chapter 17 of the Torah, chapter 17 of Sefer Devarim, book of Deuteronomy. God gives us the laws of the kings, and he tells us, here's the rules for the kings that we've been learning so much about on Thursday nights and Tuesday nights in the context of what David was allowed to do, wasn't allowed to do, etc., etc., etc. And in terms of talking about the kings, Asima Alai Melech, when the Jews will go and say to God, we want a king like everyone else, Kechol HaGoim Asher Svivotai, God says, you may have a king, Som Tasim Alech Melech, but he's going to be someone, it's not going to be an election. God will tell you who the king is. If you want a king that much, and it's not good enough having Shmuel Hanavi, the prophet Samuel, I will name the king. And of course, God sent the prophet with the anointing oil to anoint initially Saul, later David, etc., etc. Mikerav Achacha, and the king will be from your brothers. So a person who is a convert could never be a king of Israel. Has to be someone who's from your brothers, has to be born Jewish, and it has to be a male. You can never have a female king. How could you have Golda Meir as prime minister? Because it's not a Torah society. If it were a Torah society, you could never have had Golda Meir. Forgetting about the politics of it, you could never have had Golda Meir or Tzipi Livni as a prime minister of Israel. It has to be a male. Also has to be Shomer Shabbos. So there hasn't been a king, a prime minister of Israel, who would have been allowed to be king. Closest you had was Menachem Begin, who was 80% Shomer Shabbos, 90%. He was pretty close. Tasim Alecha Melech, so it's got to be a male who's from your, born Jewish, from your brothers. Lo tuchal letet alecha ish nachri, you cannot have a nachri. A nachri means a stranger. Nachri is one of the 2 or 3 synonyms for a non-Jew. The most well-known term for a non-Jew is goy. The word goy actually translates as nation. And indeed, the Jews also are a goy. We say in the Mincha davening, in the Shmon Esrei of Mincha, Mika Amcha Yisrael goy echad ba'aretz. Who is like unto thee, your Jewish nation, one nation unto earth. And so Jews are also a goy. But since the great majority of nations are not Jewish, like everybody but one, the term goy goyim plural, became synonymous with non-Jew. Nochri is the biblical term for non-Jew. Another term is akum, ovdei kochavim, people who worship stars, because the idol worshippers of old, that was a characteristic of what made them different from Jews who were monotheistic. They worship planets. They even named the days of the week for planets. Monday is named for the moon, Moon Day. Woden, one of their gods, is Wednesday, and Thor, another of their gods, Thursday, and Frigg, another god, is Friday, and Saturn is Saturday, and the sun is Sunday. And so they believed in those things. So Nochri, Goy, Akum, all are synonyms for non-Jews. And we have our synonyms for Jews too. A Jew, a Yehudi, someone from Judea, a Yid, which by anti-Semites is an insult, but that's one of our terms. A Yid is the Yiddish term for a Jew, a Yid. Asher lo achichahu, a non-brother cannot be your king. And here we go. But the thing is, even though I anoint him, lo yarbelo susim, velo yashiva to amitzrayma, laharbot susim, leman harbot sus. The king may not have more than the proper amount of horses, and may not send Jews back to Egypt to bring horses. May not have too many horses or send people back to Egypt to add to his horses. Why would a king send Jews to get horses? And, well, you need horses for your chariots, for your war. They're like tanks. You need tanks, right? You need armed personnel carriers, right? You need fighter aircraft. So in those days, you needed chariots, needed horses. But why go to Egypt for horses? The horses in Egypt, the Arabian horses, were of a special, highly prized breed. Just take a quick picture of this. Is this or is this not the most gorgeous animal on earth? This is an Egyptian horse, an Arabian horse. Is that or is that not? I'm not saying it like as a joke, sarcastically. I spent a year in Louisville, Kentucky, which is famous for Churchill Downs and thoroughbreds. And after a while, you see so many different horses, you can tell the gorgeous ones from the nice ones this is a gorgeous horse. Another one. Look at that horse. Again, for some of you, you may be looking and saying, Fisher's gone off his rocker. You put a Jew in Louisville, Kentucky for a year, look what happened to him, Nebuch. Don't get me smarted on Maker's Mark, the bourbon of Kentucky. But that's why a king of Israel, if he needed horses, would send people to Egypt to get them. And in fact, Shlomo HaMelech, King Solomon, violated several of these laws. David's son, Shlomo HaMelech, the wisest man in the world, he had more wives than he was allowed to have as a king, even though he's allowed to have a lot. You're allowed to have 18. Some suggest 36. He had more than that. And he had more horses, and that's why God punished him and the Jewish people, that the kingdom came to an end. God had intended for the kingdom of Israel to last forever. That was the promise to David HaMelech. Because you have been my servant, though you will not build a Beit HaMikdash, your son will, and it shall be a kingdom adayad, through Mashiach. And Shlomo violated core king laws by going for too many horses, sending Jews to Egypt to get them, having too many wives. The punishment was to take the kingdom away from him. But God said, I can't take the kingdom from you because I told your father David that I made him a promise for him and his son. So I'm going to take the kingdom away from the next one. The dynasty will stop early on when your son becomes king, King Rehoboam, Rehoboam, Rechavam. And that's when there was the infamous civil war that I've referenced a million times in our classes, where the people split to a northern kingdom of Samaria and a southern kingdom of Judea, and that was it. We remained two divided countries until the exiles. That's because Solomon wanted these horses. See that? So we're not allowed to go to Egypt, we learned. Not allowed to even send people to get horses from Egypt. And we continue. The Talmud. People don't all pick up on this initially, so let's mention it. As I've said many times, I certainly don't want ever to waste your time, God forbid. I'm so honored that you take out the hour or hour and 10 minutes to learn with me. I never want to waste your time by going off topic. But even though we're on topic, I get so much feedback of appreciation for all the Judaism and additional halakha that you learn in these classes when the opportunity arises, that I try to be judicious and take that opportunity. And after a year of learning with me, Thursdays and Tuesdays, you inadvertently have learned so much Judaic esoterica that's important to know. The Talmud, there are two Talmuds actually. There's the Jerusalem Talmud and the Babylonian Talmud. In Hebrew, Talmud Bavli and Talmud Yerushalmi. Essentially, what happened here is, why are there two Talmuds? What's that about? You have the Torah. Torah has the 613 laws. The 613 laws are Torah shebichtav, the written law that Moshe Rabbeinu wrote by God's dictation through the 40 years of the desert. Some hold that he wrote it from time to time. God would stop along the 40 years and say, Moshe, I'm going to dictate a certain amount now, and then we'll resume another time. Others hold that it all happened right before the Jews entered the land of Israel, when God said, I'm going to dictate everything. Bereshit bara Elokim et hashamayim v'et haaretz. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and everything was tohu vavohu, etc., to the very end. And there's a whole Talmud on that in Baba Batra, in that particular tractate, and they even talk about, and who wrote the last 8 Pesukim, and talk about Moshe dying. Did God dictate to Moshe the last 8 Pesukim verses that Moshe is describing his own death and the nation mourning for him? And Joshua, or did God, the last 8 or 12 Pesukim, actually dictate that to Joshua? So that's the written law, Torah shebichtav. And we believe, and I've gone through it so many times, and I'll go through it many times in the future, but not at the length now. The Torah Sheba'al Peh, the oral law, is what we believe God commanded Moshe Rabbeinu on Mount Sinai when the Jews were there to hear the 10 commandments, 10 pronouncements, and to receive the Torah. The Jews at Mount Sinai did not receive that Torah scroll that we associate as the Torah. It's a mistake, and everyone, well, a lot of people make that mistake thinking, I learned in yeshiva that we got the Torah from God at Mount Sinai. Well, it's not the Chumash, because the Chumash, for example, Chumash says that God later on is going to tell Moshe, talk to the rock and it gives water. And he's going to do the wrong thing. And he's not going to be able to come to Eretz Yisrael. So if he were given the written Chumash at Mount Sinai, he would know what he shouldn't do, what's going to happen, and he would have changed the story. He wouldn't have done it. He would have seen in the Chumash, he's going to name 12 spies, and 10 of them are going to be not so good. So he wouldn't have named them. He would have named others. So there's no way we could have possibly gotten the Chumash text at Mount Sinai. That's the written law I just talked about a minute ago that he wrote by dictation, either step by step or all at the end. He got the oral law, where God explained to him the 613 mitzvot in a much deeper way. So obviously God didn't talk about electricity, I don't think. But as an example, what I was talking about earlier today would be as though the Torah says don't pass fire on Shabbat. And it would be as though God were spending time on Mount Sinai saying, now here's what you do with electricity, and here's what you do with timers, and here's what you do with television. Now, obviously, God, I'm assuming God did not get into television and into timers, but the idea that he expanded on all the written law, giving him the fuller picture. So if the Shabbat says this, he taught him all 39 malachot, forbidden forms of action on Shabbat, etc., etc. Okay. So the Talmud, oral law. Well, the word oral means it wasn't written. So what happened is they passed it by word of mouth, generation to generation. Literally, and it's hard to understand how could that be, but if you've ever met a true El Primo Torah scholar, I mean, I try to do my best, but if you ever meet, there are people whose Torah knowledge, even nowadays, it just blows your mind. And I don't just mean, I think they're smarter than Einstein. There's a level of, if you've ever been in a shiur, in a Torah class, where like a Rabbi Herschel Schachter, or I could start naming names, obviously Rav Soloveitchik, obviously Lubavitch Rebbe from the previous generation, obviously Rav Shach, we can name names. They know everything. It's unbelievable. They know forget about the Chumash. They know the whole Talmud by heart. Those particular poskim who are in the top level, they know everything. It's unbelievable. And to sit in a shiur where there's a topic and they start, the way that I'll go from the main topic and I'll talk about some other things, they do the same thing, but where they go with it, they start, and they know Gemaras that no one ever learns, the ones that are so esoteric and don't apply. The level of learning is off the charts. It's just unbelievable. That's why, like when I had a friend, a Reform rabbi, he said, we're talking about something, and he said, well, that's what Moses Feinstein says. But I think, and it's like he's a friend, so I don't want to lose the friend. I don't have so many. But to listen to him, he barely can read Hebrew. And for him to say, well, that's what Moses Feinstein says. But my opinion, your opinion is built on what? 3 soft cover books you got on Amazon? Give me a break. So what ends up happening is there's the oral law, and it was passed generation to generation orally. Now we get to the Talmudic period. And Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi makes a ruling. Earlier I mentioned Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, or I misspoke. That was the great Rav in Spain. Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi made a ruling that the Romans are killing out the Rabbi Herschel Schachters and the Rabbi Soloveitchiks and the Lubavitcher Rebbe's, our number one top Rabbanim, Gedolim Poskim, who know it all by heart. They're killing them out. You know, from the Ashkenazic Musaf on Yom Kippur, the repetition where it talks about the 10 martyrs, and they killed Rabbi Akiva and all the... So they're killing them out. And all their knowledge is in their heads. And they're able to pass it to the generation because they know it, but if they're all killed out and it's not written, it's lost. So Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi made a ruling, we're going to have to put it in writing. And woe is us, woe are we, that we have to live in an era where we no longer can keep the oral law orally, that we have to put it in writing. And so it was put into writing, and that was the Mishnah. And then 300 years later, the 3 centuries of rabbinic discussions and analyses of the Mishnah came to be the Gemara. Together, Mishnah with Gemara is Talmud. So you've got the Mishnah of the year 165, and then the Gemara of around the year 465, give or take, which was put together by Ravina and Ravashi. And that's what we get. That's the books we have, Gemara. Okay, so here's the thing. The Gemara is 3 centuries of discussions of the Mishnah. It's truly what we call in secular legislative history. I wrote a law review piece that was very well received back 20, 30 years ago. And part of its greatness, I got awards, so it was a great piece, is that I took the law and I went rabbinical. And I went through all the contemporary commentaries on that law, and I dug back like Gemara, and I went all the way back to the debates on the floor of the House of Representatives and the Senate 200 years earlier that you can find in the congressional record, where they literally take it all down, not a summary, but actually the verbatim debate. And I went back, it's like going to the Gemara, and it's like, so anyway, the Talmud is like that legislative history, where you have the law now and you see how it evolved from its original terminology and how the rabbis kept interpreting it over the centuries. Okay, so here's the thing. By the year 400, the Jewish people had split not philosophically, but geographically. we now had two main centers. Many of us were back in Eretz Israel. People are under the mistaken impression that when the Romans exiled us in 135, when Beitar fell at the hands of Bar Kokhba, that the Jews went into exile for 2,000 years, until 1948, or until Herzl in 1897. Mistake. Jews never, ever left Eretz Israel. When the temple was destroyed in 70, Jews were still there 65 more years till the fall of the Bar Kokhba rebellion in Beitar. And as the Romans threw us all out, as we were going through a few minutes ago, some of them went off to Ashkenaz, some of them went off to Sefard. There also remained a substantial Jewish population that went up to Yavne in northern Israel and built yeshivas in Yavne. And they remained in there, and their descendants and their Jews never left Eretz Israel. You now had two main centers of Torah genius and learning, Yavne and Eretz Israel, and it started filtering back down to other parts of Israel, and Babylonia. Babylonia. What had happened when we got the first destruction by Nebuchadnezzar from Babylonia, where did we go? He forced the three tribes of Yehuda, Judah, Binyamin, Benjamin, and Levi. Those three tribes went to Babylonia, where they learned Aramaic, and they got comfortable. And that's the book of Daniel. Do you know the whole book of Daniel in the Bible is written in Aramaic? Practically the whole book, because that's what they spoke. And Nehemiah, Aramaic. It's a very good thing to know that it's not all Hebrew. Daniel's in Aramaic because that's what they talked. Menei tekel ufarsin. It's numbered. Your kingdom is being divided and destroyed. So Jews were living in Babylonia. They initially were led by people like Daniel and Mishael, the ones who were thrown into the lion's den and all that. And then separately, and the fiery furnace, and then the community kept growing. The second Beit HaMikdash was built by permission of Cyrus, Koresh, and later, when that got stopped for a while, Darius came, Daryavish, and he allowed us to rebuild the second Beit HaMikdash, and Nehemiah came, and all of them started rebuilding. Zerubbabel, that's that word in the Hanukkah song, Ma'oz Tzor, in one of the esoteric paragraphs, Zerubbabel. And we rebuilt the temple, and Jews came back. But guess what? We always talk about Shir Amal B'Shuv Hashem et Shivat Zion Hayinu Kachomim Azimali Schopin. Oh, when the Jews got to return to Israel, we were like dreamers, and everybody was singing and dancing. We didn't have that many dreamers. The majority of Jews stayed in Babylonia. How could they not take advantage? Well, how do we not take advantage? You have Eretz Israel, and so many of us are living in Australia, Canada, the United States. My reason is that I had a lung transplant. I've got certain health issues, or I'd be there now. That was our plan with my wife, Ellen Zichrona Levrach, and I, and we were going to be doing it. And instead, I have the zechus, the merit that I've been able to send about 12 members of my shul have made Aliyah on my watch. I'm very proud of that. So we're all supposed to be there, but most of us are in exile. How is that possible? Because of our sins, we were exiled from our land. And here we are saying it on Musaf, Shmona Esrei of the Yontifs, of the Chagim in America. Oh, because of our sins, we live in exile. No, if you feel so bad about it, so go to Eretz Israel. Many people have made Aliyah, Nefesh B'Nefesh and all of that. Okay, so you have Jews. 80% of the Jews did not go to Eretz Israel when the second temple was being rebuilt. They stayed in Babylonia. And then what happened? You had the same Mishnah. Everybody's working off the same Mishnah eventually, because that was the oral law that they had. And they learned the oral law. So you know what? There were issues for the Jews living in Palestine, Eretz Israel. Palestine and Israel is the same thing. There's no such thing as a Palestine. It was just named by the Romans, land of Israel. So you had the Jews living in Eretz Israel, as they were learning Mishnahs and analyzing them in the yeshivas of Eretz Israel. Their focus, their foci, were on the agricultural laws of the Mishnah. They went through everything. They went through tort law and contract law and everything in the Mishnah, but their main focus was agricultural law. You know why? Because if you lived in Eretz Israel and you were an Orthodox Jew, which everyone was, you had to know the laws of Shemitah, letting the land rest on the seventh year, and you had to learn the laws of Jubilee, Yovel, and all the laws of Eretz Israel. So, and there's so many. That's why if you don't live in Eretz Israel, it's very hard to fulfill all the mitzvot, because so many of them require living in Israel to do with the fruit and the vegetables and all of that. So that was what they were focusing on. Meantime, in Babylonia, yes, they learned also, they went through the analyses of Shemitah and of all these laws, of Yovel and all the agricultural laws, but they were more interested in the contract law and the tort law and all of those laws, because the land of Israel laws, they were good to learn and know, but they weren't relevant because we don't live there and we're not going to. We're in Babylonia. So they focused more on the other. As a result, there are two Talmuds, the Babylonian Talmud and the Jerusalem Talmud. The Jerusalem Talmud is top heavy on analyses and legislative history of Israeli land agriculture, but it also has other stuff. Laws of marriage and divorce, laws of Pesach and Shavuos. And then on the other hand, the Babylonian Talmud, Talmud Bavli, is more top heavy on everything else, and very not top heavy on the land of Israel laws, though there are a lot of laws. It's one of the six parts of one of the six Sefarim of the Mishnah. So there's the Babylonian Talmud, and that's what they teach. That's what we learn in America. And everywhere but Israel, and even in Israel, that's what when people say, I'm learning Gemara, I'm learning Talmud, we don't even add the adjective Babylonian. It's understood. You're learning Gemara, you're learning Talmud Bavli. Because many of these laws, even if you're living in Israel, don't go into effect until the Beit HaMikdash is rebuilt. So like the laws of sacrifices and korbanot. All of those laws are discussed in great, great detail in the Yerushalmi, but it doesn't pertain. It is intellectually fascinating. And if you're a Kohen and you believe every day Mashiach might come, somebody's got to be on top of this stuff. You know how like when Trump got elected, first day he was signing 200 executive orders? Whether you like it or not, not getting into the politics of it. But you know how it came in right away? I'm all ready. That's what they have Kohanim in Israel. There are Kohanim in Israel who are already 200 sacrifices ready to get going tomorrow morning when Mashiach comes. Mashiach did not come today. Machratayim. We'll wait till the next day. So you have people learning that, but most people don't. Okay. So this is from Talmud Yerushalmi, the Jerusalem Talmud. It's harder to find. I had to do a little bit more research to find it, but Baruch Hashem, I found this Mishnah or actually a Gemara. It says Jerusalem Talmud, Talmud Yerushalmi, Sanhedrin. We are used to, when I learned Babylonian Talmud with you, we are used to a folio number and side A or B. The Yerushalmi is structured differently. It's not structured by folio, which is like a page, and side A or side B. It's rather, it's based on the chapter and the Mishnah number. Okay. So we see here, they're learning a law about, for example, are you allowed to rebuild Jericho? And there's a whole interesting discussion about, are you allowed to rebuild Jericho? That would be very pertinent to the Jews living in Israel, because Jericho was there and it's awaiting being rebuilt. And it's less pertinent than Babylonia, where we ain't going to see Jericho in our lifetimes. So it's not surprising. So they're discussing Jericho, Jericho, and they're going here and there. I'll do this in English. Another difference. The Jerusalem Talmud Yerushalmi is in Hebrew, because they were living in Israel. That's their language. And the Babylonian Talmud is in Aramaic, because that's the everyday language they spoke. And they'll quote from the Torah and other sources, Mishnah in Hebrew. And the Mishnah is Hebrew because Rabbi Yehuda Nasi was compiling the Mishnah while Jews were living in Israel. But by the time the Babylonian Talmud was already being redacted and put together, by then it was already Aramaic. So anyway, Reb Shimon ben Elazar says they did not rebuild it, but built another town. Okay. And then are you allowed to live in Jericho? One may not build another town and call it Jericho, or Jericho and call it another town. I've taught you this in the past. We certainly don't want to take out a lot of time on it now because that's not the point. But just a side point, the city of Jericho may not be rebuilt. Even now, you can rebuild, and they do rebuild every single one of the biblical cities, Hebron, Beit Lechem, God willing, when we are sovereign in Judea completely and we get rid of the trespassers, they'll be able to rebuild Beit Lechem and Hebron completely, and all of those cities, Bet El and Shechem and Shiloh, but you're not allowed to rebuild Yericho. That's a command from God through Joshua in the book of Joshua. Okay. And so they're bringing out a pasuk from the Torah. You shall not continue to return on this way. You may not return for dwelling. You may return for peddling, business, or to conquer, but not for dwelling. Okay. They're quoting to say, just as you're not allowed to rebuild Jericho, but if you have some business in Jericho, or you're passing through Jericho, you're allowed. And the Yerushalmi Talmud is telling us it's like the same thing with Egypt. You know how we learned last week that you're not allowed to live in Egypt? Yeshiva means to sit or to reside. When people go to yeshiva to learn, where does your son go? Where does your daughter go? They're learning in yeshiva. Yeshiva means to sit. It's called yeshiva because you get there at 8 in the morning and you sit learning Torah till 8 at night. And that's how it got the name yeshiva. So they're going to yeshiva, and obviously now it's already assumed a second synonymous definition, namely a Jewish religious school. But that's what it means. It means a place where you sit. So anyway, you're not allowed to sit to reside. Liyeshiva einat choser. You're not allowed to return to Egypt. Similarly, Jericho. Choser at l'schora, but you're allowed to go for business purposes, for liprakmatya. Again, business, economic, v'lichboshet aretz, and you're allowed to go through if you're conquering the land of Israel. So if the only way you can get from point A to point B is by bringing the army through Jericho or through Egypt, that's allowed, but not allowed to settle there. Mishnah Torah, the Rambam himself, who is the fascinating one in this, because again, he's the one who was in Spain and ends up in Egypt. By the way, where did he die and where is he buried? There's a tremendous disagreement on that. It's believed either he died and was buried in Egypt, or he died and was buried in Sefard. Ellen Zichrona Levrach and I went special to Sefard just to go to the burial place of Rambam, which is very close to the burial place of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, a very famous rabbinical authority in the Talmud who negotiated with the Romans to allow us to retain Yavne even as they were destroying everything else. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, and nearby is famous Rabbi Meir and the wife of Rabbi Akiva, Rachel. It's like a whole day. Most people never do it. It was so worth it for Ellen and me to just spend the whole day in Tzfat, going from one to another. But anyway, Rambam is there. And so, let's find it. So Rambam is teaching in Hilchot Malachim, Perek Hey, in chapter 5, Halacha Zayin, Mutar lishkon b'chol ha'olam chutz me'eretz Mitzrayim. You're allowed to dwell anywhere in the world except in Egypt. So is he a hypocrite? We're going to go through this. Obviously, he's not a hypocrite. In the same way, am I a hypocrite? I'm teaching my class you should live in Israel, and here I am in Irvine. There are circumstances where it is what it is. So I have two choices. One choice is never to teach people they should live in Israel. I can't do that. You're supposed to. So I have to address, however so briefly, so Nu, why aren't you there? So I explain. Rambam, Nu, why aren't you there? He explains. But let's go forward. So you're supposed to, you may live anywhere in the world. You live in Russia, live in China, live in the worst place imaginable, but not in Egypt. Min hayam gadol va'at hama'arav. You may live from the Mediterranean Sea as far west as you can imagine. As I said, I got Europe wrong. I first was saying Europe is to the right. It's to the left. I was thinking Columbus. That's my excuse, or Magellan. But anyway, he's saying you can live west, 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 west. That's why so much rabbinic literature talks about that when we daven, we face east. Why doesn't the rabbinic literature just say face Jerusalem? It often even goes more, like Rabbi Yehuda Levi, in his very famous poem from the Middle Ages. Libi b'mizrach v'ani b'sof ha'marav. My heart is in the east, and I live at the utmost corner of the west. Okay, they didn't really. He was being poetic, and he wasn't addressing what Columbus would find. But he was living like here. This was the world. My heart is in the east, and I am in the utmost corner of the west. I often quote that from my own situation. My heart is in the east, and I'm in Irvine. So Rambam saying from Minayama Gadol Hamarav, from the Mediterranean Sea. So where's the Mediterranean? Here's Israel. Here is the Mediterranean Sea. Greece is Mediterranean, and Italy has some Mediterranean. I mean, that's Mediterranean. Gaza, beautiful seafront property, and they blew it. They blew it. So, Keneged Eretz Kush, Keneged Amidbar. You go past Ethiopia, past the desert. I don't know exactly where Ethiopia is, but Africa, here's Africa. So you can go past Africa, past the Sinai Desert, and all the way. Okay. Hakol asur lit yashev ba. So he's talking about you're not allowed to live in Egypt. Bishlosha mekamot izhira Torah shelo lashov Mitzrayim. 3 different places the Torah warns us you may not go to Egypt. We learned it last week. As it says in Devarim Yud Zayin, lo tosifim l'shuv derech hazeh. First of all, there's the commandment that the king is not allowed to take Jews and bring them back in that direction to collect horses or whatever. Lo tosif od lerota, in Devarim 28, in the great Tochacha, where God warns you what will happen. God forbid you'll ever go back to Egypt. And at the Red Sea, when we were crossing in Exodus, Lo tusifu lerotam od olam. God said, as the people were screaming, what are we going to do? They're going to die. They're going to kill all of us. And God told Moshe to tell the people, stop crying, just be quiet and watch, because some miracle is going to happen right now. And get a good look at the Egyptians, because you're never going to see them again. The Alexandria Bechlal HaIsur. And Alexandria is part of what was forbidden. Not allowed to live in Alexandria. Now, Rambam, who's in the 1100s, therefore knowingly was adding Alexandria as a side point, because Alexandria and the destruction of Alexandria, we already learned it from the Talmud, which is like 500-700 years before Rambam. So Rambam, learning the Talmud, already knew the whole story about Alexandria. So he's pointing out not only not allowed to live in Egypt, but they weren't allowed to live in Alexandria either. Mutar l'chzor li'eretz Mitzrayim l'schora v'lib pragmatia. You are allowed to go back for the purpose of business. V'lichbo sharat tzorach hirot. So it's exactly what I just taught you from the Jerusalem Talmud. You'll remember what Rambam was doing is he was gathering halacha from the Chumash, the Torah, and the Mishnah, and the Gemara, and he was codifying it. So he brings it. Ve'ein asur el hishtakei. This is interesting. Now we start getting into a little refinement of it. He's saying, you're not allowed to go back to Egypt, but only not to make a permanent move. Let's say someone lives in, I lived in Brooklyn, and well, when I came to LA, well, it's complicated. I don't want to waste time on that. Let's say someone moves and makes a permanent move. Let's say an illegal alien from Colombia decides I'm going to America and I'm going to stay there. I'm done with Colombia, and I'm going to stay there. So that is lehishtakeah, to make a move with the intention never to leave. Maybe you'll come to California, move to Texas, but you're never going to leave. So Rambam is saying, not only are you allowed to go into Egypt for business or to go through for conquering land, but you're actually allowed to go ahead and rent an apartment or buy a house, build a house, as long as it's not your intention to make Egypt your permanent dwelling. Let's say the University of Cairo offers you a professorship to be a professor of pyramidology, and you accept a position, and your expectation is you're now 40 years old, and you're going to stay there till age 60, mandatory retirement, and then you'll come back to Israel. That is not lehishtakeah. That is temporary. It'll be 20 years, but Rambam is saying that's allowed. You're allowed to move to Egypt as long as it's not your intention to stay there permanently. The ein lokina loves, and it is interesting. In the Torah, if you deliberately violate a negative law, you deliberately do something you're not allowed to do, prohibited, and there are two witnesses warning you, you'll be punished if you do it, and you do it anyway, the punishment frequently is malchus, is being whipped. There's a certain number of whippings. It's a Torah punishment in certain cases. Obviously, it rarely happens, because if two witnesses are standing there saying, don't do it, what kind of shmendrik is going to go ahead and do it? So Rambam says, even though you're forbidden to live in Egypt, although you're allowed to go temporarily, if you go there and you're intending to do it permanently, we do not whip you because because when you entered, you did not commit a sin. Even though your intention was to live there permanently in violation of Torah law, although you're allowed to go temporarily, when you walked into Egypt, whatever you were thinking, we do not punish based on thinking. It's not a sin to think. There are things you shouldn't think, but you don't get whips for thinking. You're thinking to yourself, I hate that guy. I'm going to kill him. That, you don't get whipped for that. What you're thinking, you're thinking. 99% and more of the things we think, we don't go through. If someone actually has in his head, I'm going to Egypt and I'm going to stay there permanently, ein bo ma'aseh. Well, he hasn't done anything. He's entered Egypt, but he hasn't done it permanently. Frankly, it'll never be permanent till he dies there. Now Rambam's going out. He's saying, what I'm about to say now does not appear in the Chumash, does not appear in the Mishnah, does not appear in the Talmud. It's just, I think, namely Rambam is saying, based on the law, I think, Yera Eli, it seems to me, that if a king of Israel conquers the land of Egypt, al pi betin, with the prior approval of the Sanhedrin, of a properly established Jewish court, so that it's not just out on a limb, but he's been given a formal heter, permission by a Sanhedrin, to go and conquer part of Egypt. Seems to me, shehi mutarit, seems to me that would be allowed. Even though the Torah says you're not allowed to live in Egypt permanently, if a Beit Din says he's allowed to make war and take the land, seems to me that should be okay. That's his opinion. V'lo his hira ela l'shuv la yechidim. Now he's adding more. It doesn't say this. He's just looking at the text and he's inferring certain things. It seems to me that it's only individuals that are not allowed to move into Egypt or l'shkon ba. V'hi biyad akum mipnei shema'asehu mekukalan yoter mikol artzot. It seems to me that it would only be that you can't move to Egypt if Egypt is under the sovereignty of certain idolaters whose teachings and worship are so forbidden. But if Egypt were under the sovereignty of a monotheistic group of non-Jews, it seems to me perhaps you would be allowed to go there. Because it says, we learned this last week from Vayikra Yudchet, it says chapter 18 of Leviticus, that you're not allowed to go to Egypt partly because of their perverted morality. People engaged in incest and other things. We went through it last week. So Rambam is saying if Egypt is in sovereignty of a people who are not perpetrating Torah-listed corruptions and deviances and perversions, I think you'd be allowed to go. I've got 3 more of these for tonight. They're short. Of course, you could leave at any time, but if you have a little bit of time, it won't take us long. Here we go. Now we continue. From another part of Rambam's Mishnah Torah, Hilchot Isurei Bia. He's learning the laws of forbidden intercourse. And is he not allowed to have intercourse? Well, maybe I'll save this one for next week, because I don't want to go too far over. Well, that's going to be next week, the same thing. And that's going to be next week, the same thing. So next week, part 3, we will mostly be finishing, and then there will be a part 4. Part 4 is going to be great. I mean, it's all great, I hope. It's going to be an extended responsum by Rabbi Ovadia Yosef, who was asked, if you know all of the background context that we're learning, with that in your mind, so now you're an expert on the laws of residing in Egypt. Now you jump ahead to the year 2000 or something like that, 1997. And the question is, Itona'im da'ati'im, for Orthodox journalists, Ha'im mutar le'itona'im Yisrael and Solam Mitzrayim, is it permitted for an Orthodox, it refers to all Jews, but the understanding is the other Jews won't listen to what Rav Avad Yosef says, but at least for Orthodox journalists, are they allowed l'nsol Mitzrayim to travel to Egypt, kedei la'amod mikarov ulidvol hamashamatan shalom b'diyunei idat kair? Are they allowed to go to Egypt to report on the scene the negotiations for peace between Begin and Sadat in Egypt? Really interesting. We're certainly not going to have the time for this week or next. So to wrap it up for tonight, what we've now confirmed is, and I'll just give you a flavor of what's coming up next week. We now have absolutely established with other commentaries and commentators that you are allowed to go into Egypt, notwithstanding the Torah text, if it's for the purposes of business, even if it's not for business, but just to live there for a few years, just to vacation there, just to live there 20 years. You have studied Egyptian dialect Arabic, and you'd like to live there. It turns out the commentators say you're allowed to. And the question is going to be next week. Where we're going to go with it next week is as follows, as I wrap up now. This is really interesting. That's why we're going to do all the different opinions. Is Egypt Egypt? Is Egypt Egypt? If you go to visit Rome, is that the Roman Empire Rome of the gladiators and Marcus Aurelius Crassus from Spartacus? Is that, if you go to Athens, is that Greek Empire Athens? Well, think about this. And I'm going to keep this to 3 minutes, so don't be afraid I'm going to go on a long thing. We always talk about, very proudly, what other people but the Jews have lasted 5,000 years. There's no other nation that's still around today. The Babylonians are gone, and the old Persian Empire is gone, and the Medians are gone, and these ones, all the empires are gone, just we. Well, isn't there Athens? Don't they have the Colosseum? Or don't they have the Parthenon? Isn't there Rome and the Colosseum and the Arch of Titus? And the answer is, yeah, geographically it's still there, but there are different people. Those are not the Romans from the Romans. Those are Italians. Those are not the Greeks from the Greeks. Those are different Greeks. There's been intermarriage. People from Europe have moved here, and these moved there, and these people, just like our 10 tribes, our 10 lost tribes. They're just intermixed, and who knows where they are. And at times of Mashiach, we're told by, I believe it's Yeshaya, who said, in Mashiach times, all the lost tribes will come back, and all the lost people of Yehuda will come back. But everybody's mixed. And the Iraqis, that's the land of Babylonia, they're not the Babylonians, and so on and so forth. Consequently, the question becomes, and we're going to learn it, God willing, next week, are today's Egyptians the Egyptian empire? If they are, that's one thing. But if you hold that today's Egyptians are to the Egyptian empire as today's Italians to the Roman Empire, as today's Greeks to the Greek Empire, so there's suddenly a new thing here. The law would not apply. Maybe what God was commanding is you're not allowed to go to Egypt of the Egyptian empire, where they have the perversions, Kemasei Eretz Mitzrayim, that it talks about in chapter 18 of Leviticus. That you're not allowed to go to that Egypt, but to go to today's Cairo and today's Alexandria, where you have Muslims and you have Coptic Christians and you have whatever's going on in Egypt. Maybe it doesn't apply. It's really interesting, some tremendously interesting commentary. We'll do that next week, God willing.